Mark Samuels, The White Hands. You may remember Alfred Muswell, whom devotees of the weird tale will know as the author of numerous articles on the subject of literary ghost stories. He died in obscurity just over a year ago. Muswell had been an Oxford don for a time, but left the cloisters of the university after an academic scandal. A former student, now a journalist, wrote of him in a privately published memoir. Muswell attempted single-handedly to alter the academic criteria of excellence in literature. He sought to eradicate what he termed the tyranny of materialism and realism from his teaching. He would loom over us in his black robes at lectures and tutorials, tearing prescribed and classic books to shreds with his gloved hands, urging us to read instead work by the likes of Sheridan Le Fanu, Vernon Lee, M.R. James, and Lilith Blake. Muswell was a familiar sight amongst the squares and courtyards of the colleges at night, and would stalk abroad like some bookish revenant. He had a very plump face and a pair of circular spectacles. His eyes peered into the darkness with an indefinable expression that could be somewhat disturbing. You will recall that Muswell's eccentric theories about literature enjoyed a brief but notorious vogue in the 1950s. In a series of essays in the short-lived American fantasy magazine The Necrophile, he championed the supernatural tale. This was at a time when other academics and critics were turning away from the genre in disgust, following the illiterate excesses of pulp magazines, such as Weird Tales. Muswell argued that the anthropocentric concerns of realism had the effect of stifling the much more profound study of infinity. Contemplation of the infinite, he contended, was the faculty that separated man from beast. Realism, in his view, was the literature of the prosaic. It was the quest for the hidden mysteries, he contended, which formed the proper subject of all great literature. Muswell also believed that literature, in its highest form, should unravel the secrets of life and death. This latter concept was never fully explained by him, but he hinted that its attainment would involve some actual alteration in the structure of reality itself. This, perhaps inevitably, led him to being dismissed in academic circles as a foolish mystic. After his quiet expulsion from Oxford, Muswell retreated to the lofty heights of Highgate. From here, the London village that had harbored Samuel Taylor Coleridge during the final phase of his struggle against opium addiction, Muswell continued his literary crusade. A series of photographs reproduced in the 4th issue of The Necrophile show Muswell wandering through the leafy streets of Highgate, clad in his black three-piece suit, cigarette jammed between lips, plump and bespectacled. In one of his gloved hands is a book of ghost stories by the writer he most admired, Lilith Blake. This Victorian author is perhaps best known for her collection of short stories, The Reunion and others. Then, as now, fabulously rare, this book was printed in an edition of only 100 copies. Amongst the cognoscenti, it has acquired legendary status. Muswell was undoubtedly the greatest authority on her life and works. He alone possessed the little that remained of her extant correspondence, as well as diaries, photographs, and other personal effects. In moving to Highgate, Muswell was perhaps most influenced by the fact that Blake had been resident in the village for all of the 22 years of her brief life. Her mortal remains were interred in the Old West Cemetery in Swains Lane. I first met Alfred Muswell after writing a letter to him requesting information about Lilith Blake for an article I was planning on supernatural writers of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. After an exchange of correspondence, he suggested that we should meet one afternoon in the reading room of the Highgate Literary and Scientific Institution. From there he would escort me to his rooms, which apparently were difficult to find without help, being hidden in the maze of narrow brick passageways beyond Pond Square. It was a very cold, clear winter afternoon when I alighted at Highgate Underground Station, and made my way up Southwood Lane. Snow had fallen since the night before, and the lane was almost deserted. Only the sound of my footsteps crunching in the brittle snow broke the silence. When I reached Highgate Village, I paused for a while to take in my surroundings. The Georgian houses were cloaked in white and glittered in the freezing sunshine. A sharp wind blew chilly gusts across the sagging roofs and chimney pots. One or two residents, clad in greatcoats and well muffled, plodded warily along. I accosted one of these pedestrians, and was directed by him towards the Institute. This was a whitewashed structure, 2 floors high, facing the square on the corner of Swain's Lane. Through one of the ground-floor windows I could see the glow of a coal fire within, and a plump man reading in an easy-chair. It was Alfred Muswell. After dusting the snowflakes from my clothes, I made my way inside and introduced myself to him. He struggled out of his chair, stood upright like a hermit crab quitting its shell, and threw out a gloved hand for me to grasp. He was dressed in his habitual black suit, a cigarette drooping from his bottom lip. His eyes peered at me intensely from behind those round glasses. His hair had thinned and grown white since the photographs in the necrophile. The loss of hair was mainly around the crown, giving him a somewhat monkish appearance. I hung up my duffel coat and scarf and sat down in the chair facing him. "We can sit here undisturbed for a few more minutes at least," he said. "The other members are in the library attending some lecture about that charlatan James Joyce." I nodded, as if in agreement. But my attention was fixed on Muswell's leather gloves. He seemed always to wear them. He had worn a similar pair in the necrophile photographs. I noticed the apparent emaciation of the hands and long fingers that the gloves concealed. His right hand fidgeted constantly with his cigarette, while the fingers of his left coiled and uncoiled repeatedly. It was almost as if he were uncomfortable with the appendages. "I'm very pleased to talk with a fellow devotee of Lilith Blake's tales," he said in his odd, strained voice. "Oh, I wouldn't describe myself as a devotee. Her work is striking, of course, but my own preferences are for Blackwood and Mackin. Blake seems to me to lack balance. Her world is one of unremitting gloom and decay." Muswell snorted at my comment. He exhaled a great breath of cigarette smoke in my direction and said, "Unremitting gloom and decay? Rather say that she makes desolation glorious. I believe that De Quincey once wrote, 'Holy was the grave, saintly its darkness, pure its corruption.' Words that describe Lilith Blake's work perfectly. Mackin, indeed. That red-faced old coot with his deluded Anglo-Catholic rubbish. The man was a drunken clown, obsessed by sin. And Blackwood? Pantheistic rot that belongs to the Stone Age. The man wrote mainly for money, and he wrote too much. No, believe me, if you want the truth beyond the frontier of appearances, it is to Lilith Blake that you must turn. She never compromises. Her stories are infinitely more than mere accounts of supernatural phenomena." His voice had reached a peak of shrillness, and it was all I could do not to squirm in my chair. Then he seemed to regain his composure and drew a handkerchief across his brow. "You must excuse me. I have allowed my convictions to ruin my manners. I so seldom engage in debate these days that when I do, I become overexcited." He allowed himself to calm down and was about to speak again when a side door opened and a group of people bustled into the room. They were chatting about the Joyce lecture that had evidently just finished. Muswell got to his feet and made for his hat and overcoat. I followed him. Outside, in the cold afternoon air, he looked back over his shoulder and crumpled up his face in a gesture of disgust. "How I detest those fools," he intoned. We trudged through the snow, across the square and into a series of passageways. Tall buildings with dusty windows pressed upon us from both sides, and after a number of twists and turns we reached the building that contained Muswell's rooms. They were in the basement, and we walked down some well-worn steps outside, leaving the daylight above us. He opened the front door, and I followed him inside. Muswell flicked on the light switch, and a single bulb suspended from the ceiling and reaching halfway towards the bare floor revealed the meager room. On each of the walls were long bookcases stuffed with volumes. There was an armchair and a footstool in one corner, along with a small circular table on which a pile of books teetered precariously. A dangerous-looking Cowler gas fire stood in the opposite corner. Muswell brought another chair, with a canvas back and seat, from an adjoining room and invited me to sit down. Soon afterwards he hauled a large trunk from the same room. It was extremely old, and bore the monogram L.B. on its side. He unlocked the trunk with some ceremony, and then sat down, lighting yet another cigarette, his stare fixed on my face. I took a notebook from my pocket, and drawing sheaves of manuscripts from the trunk, began to scan them. It seemed dark stuff, and rather strange, but just what I needed for the article, and there was a mountain of it to get through. Muswell, meanwhile, made a melancholy remark apropos of nothing, the significance of which I did not appreciate until much later. "Loneliness," he said, "can drive a man into mental regions of extreme strangeness." I nodded absently. I had found a small box, and on opening it my excitement mounted. It contained a sepia-colored photographic portrait of Lilith Blake, dated 1890. It was the first I had seen of her, and must have been taken just before her death. Her beauty was quite astonishing. Muswell leaned forward. He seemed to be watching my reaction with redoubled interest. Lilith Blake's raven black and luxuriant hair curled down to her shoulders. Her face was oval, finished with a small pointed chin. The eyes, wide apart and piercing, seemed to gaze across the vastness of the time that separated us. Her neck was long and pale, her forehead rounded, and stray curls of hair framed the temples. The fleshy lips were slightly parted, and her small, sharp teeth gleamed whitely. Around her neck hung a string of pearls, and she wore a jet-black velvet dress. The most delicate and lovely white hands that I had ever seen were folded across her bosom. Although the alabaster skin of her face and neck was extremely pale, her hands were paler. They were whiter than the purest snow. It was as if daylight had never touched them. The length of her graceful fingers astonished me. I must have sat there for some time in silent contemplation of that intoxicating image. Muswell, becoming impatient, finally broke my reverie in a most violent and unnecessary manner. He snatched the photograph from me and held it in the air while he spoke, his voice rising to a feverish pitch. "Here is the hopeless despair of one haunted by the night, one who had gone down willingly into the grave with a black ecstasy in her heart instead of fear." I could only sit there in stunned silence. To me, Muswell seemed close to a complete nervous breakdown. Later, Muswell must have helped me to sort through the various papers in the trunk. I remember little of the detail. I do know that by the time I finally left his rooms and found my way back to the square through the snow, I had realized that my research into Blake's work would be of the utmost importance to my academic career. Muswell had treasure in his keeping, a literary gold mine, and, given the right handling, it could make my name. After that, my days were not my own. Try as I might, I could not expunge the vision of Blake from my mind. Her face haunted my thoughts, beckoning me onwards in my quest to discover the true meaning of her work. The correspondence between Muswell and myself grew voluminous as I sought to arrange a time when I would be enabled to draw further on his collection. For a while he seemed to distrust my mounting interest, but at last he accepted my enthusiasm as genuine. He welcomed me as a kindred spirit. By a happy chance, I even managed to rent a room in his building. And so, during the course of the winter months, I shut myself away with Muswell, poring over Blake's letters and personal effects. I cannot deny that the handling of those things began to feel almost sacrilegious. But as I read the letters, diaries, and notebooks, I could see that Muswell had spoken only the truth when he described Blake as supreme in the field of supernatural literature. He would scuttle around his library like a spider, climbing step-ladders and hauling out volumes from the shelves, passing them down through the gloomy space to me. He would mark certain passages that he believed furthered a greater understanding of Blake's life and work. Outside, the frequent snow showers filled the gap between his basement window and the pavement above with icy whiteness. My research was progressing well, my notebook filling up with useful quotations and annotations, but somehow I felt that I was failing to reach the essence of Lilith. The most potent aspect of her vision was eluding my understanding. It was becoming agonizing to be so close to her, and yet to feel that her most secret and beautiful mysteries were buried from my view. "I believe," Muswell once said, "that mental isolation is the essence of weird fiction. Isolation when confronted with disease, with madness, with horror, and with death. These are the reverberations of the infinity that torments us. It is Blake who delineates these echoes of doom for us. She alone exposes our inescapable blind stumbling towards eternal annihilation. She alone shows our souls screaming in the darkness with none to heed our cries. Ironic, isn't it, that such a beautiful young woman should possess an imagination so dark and riddled with nightmare?" Muswell took a deep drag on his cigarette, and in contemplating his own words, seemed to gaze through everything into a limitless void. Sometimes, when Muswell was away, I would have the collection to myself. Blake's personal letters became as sacred relics to me. Her framed photograph attained a special significance, and I was often unable to prevent myself from running my fingers around the outline of her lovely face. As time passed, and my research into Lilith Blake's oeuvre began to yield even more fascinating results, I felt that I was now ready to afford her the posthumous attention that she so richly deserved. Whereas previously I had planned to merely include references to her work in my lengthy article on supernatural fiction during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, I now realized that she had to be accorded a complete critical book of her own. Such was the importance of the literary legacy I had stumbled across through my association with Muswell. It seemed obvious to me that the man had little real idea of the prime importance of the materials in his possession, and that his reclusive lifestyle had led him to regard anything relating to this dead and beautiful creature as his own personal property. His understanding was hopelessly confused by the unsubstantiated assertion that he made of the importance of the work behind the works, which I took to mean some obscure mystical interpretation he had formulated in his own muddled, aging brain. One afternoon he came across me working on my proposed book and took an apparent polite interest in my writing. But mingled in with that interest was an infuriating sarcasm. I voiced my contention that Blake deserved a much higher place in the literary pantheon. The only reasonable explanation for the failure of her work to achieve this was, I had discovered, the almost total lack of contemporary interest in it. I could trace no extant reviews of the reunion and others in any of the literary journals of the time, nor any mention of her in the society columns of the period. At this statement, Muswell actually laughed out loud. Holding one of his cigarettes between those thin gloved fingers, he waved it in the air dismissively and said, "I should have thought that you would have found the silence surrounding her person and work suggestive, as I did. Do not mistake silence for indifference. Any imbecile might make that erroneous conclusion, and indeed many have done so in the past. Lilith Blake was no Count Stenbock, merely awaiting rediscovery. She was deliberately not mentioned. Her work was specifically excluded from consideration. How much do you think was paid simply to ensure that she had a fitting tomb in Highgate Cemetery? But pray continue. Tell me more of your article, and I shall try to take into consideration your youthful naivety." As I continued to expand on my theories, I saw clearly that Muswell began to smirk in a most offensive fashion. Why, it was as if he were humoring me. My face flushed, and I stood up, my back rigid with tension. I was close to breaking point and could not tolerate this old fool's patronizing attitude any longer. He took a step backwards and bowed, rather affectedly, in some idiotic gentlemanly gesture. But as he did so, he almost lost his footing, as if a bout of dizziness had overcome him. I was momentarily startled by the action, and he took the opportunity to make his exit. But before he did so, he uttered some departing words. "If you knew what I know, my friend, and perhaps you soon will, then you would find this literary criticism as horribly amusing as I do. But I am extremely tired, and I will leave you to your work." It seemed obvious to me at that point that Muswell was simply not fit to act as the trustee for Lilith Blake's estate. Moreover, his theatrics and lack of appreciation for my insights indicated progressive mental deterioration. I would somehow have to wrest control over the estate from his enfeebled grasp for the sake of Blake's reputation. The opportunity came more quickly than I could have dared hope. One evening in February, Muswell returned from one of his infrequent appointments looking particularly exhausted. I had noticed the creeping fatigue in his movements for a number of weeks. In addition to an almost constant sense of distraction, he had also lost a considerable amount of weight. His subsequent confession did not in any case come as a shock. "The game is up for me," he said. "I am wasting away. The doctor says I will not last much longer. I am glad that the moment of my assignation with Blake draws near. You must ensure that I am buried with her." Muswell contemplated me from across the room, the light of the dim electric bulb reflecting off the lenses of his spectacles and veiling the eyes behind. He continued, "There are secrets that I have hidden from you, but I will reveal them now. I have come to learn that there are those who, though dead, lie in their coffins beyond the grip of decay. The power of eternal visions preserves them. There they lie, softly dead and dreaming. Lilith Blake is one of these, and I shall be another. You will be our guardian in this world. You will ensure that our bodies are not disturbed. Once dead, we must not be awakened from the eternal dream. It is for the protection of Lilith and myself that I have allowed you to share in my thoughts and her literary legacy. Everything will make sense once you have read her final works." He climbed up the steepest stepladder to the twilight of the room's ceiling, and took a metal box from the top of one of the bookcases. He unlocked it, and drew from within an old writing book bound in crumpled black leather. The title page was written in Lilith Blake's distinctive longhand style. I could see that it bore the title, "The White Hands and Other Tales." "This volume," he said, handing it to me, contains the final stories. They establish the truth of all that I have told you. The book must now be published. I want to be vindicated after I die. This book will prove in the most shocking way the supremacy of the horror tale over all other forms of literature. As I intimated to you once before, these stories are not accounts of supernatural phenomena, but are supernatural phenomena in themselves. Understand this. Blake was dead when these stories were conceived. But she still dreams, and transmitted these images from her tomb to me, so that I might transcribe them for her. When you read them, you will know that I am not insane. All will become clear to you. You will understand how, at the point of death, the eternal dream is begun. It allows dissolution of the body to be held at bay for as long as one continues the dreaming. I realized that Muswell's illness had deeply affected his mind. In order to bring him back to some awareness of reality, I said, "You say that Blake telepathically dictated the stories, and you transcribed them? Then how is it that the handwriting is hers and not your own?" Muswell smiled painfully, paused, and then for the first and last time took off his gloves. The hands were Lilith Blake's, the same pale, attenuated forms I recognized from her photograph. "I asked for a sign that I was not mad," said Muswell, "and it was given to me." "4 weeks later, Muswell died. The doctor's certificate listed the cause of death as heart failure. I had been careful, and as he was already ill, there was little reason for the authorities to suspect anything. Frankly, I had never countenanced the idea of fulfilling any of Muswell's requests, and I arranged for his body to be cremated and interred at Marylebone and St. Pancras Cemetery, amongst a plain of small anonymous graves and headstones. He would not rest at Highgate Cemetery alongside Lilith Blake. The ceremony was a simple one, and beside myself there were no other mourners in attendance. Muswell's expulsion from Oxford had ensured that his old colleagues were wary of keeping in touch with him, and there were no surviving members of his family who chose to pay their last respects. The urn containing his ashes was interred in an unmarked plot, and the priest who presided over the affair muttered his way through the rites in a mechanical, indifferent fashion. As the ceremony concluded, and I made my way across that dull sepulchral plain under a gray and miserable sky, I had a sense of finality. Muswell was gone forever, and had found that oblivion he seemed so anxious to avoid. It was a few days later that I made my first visit to Lilith Blake's vault. She had been interred in the old west section of Highgate Cemetery, and I was unable to gain access alone. There were only official tours of the place available, and I attended one, but afterwards I paid the guide to conduct me privately to Blake's vault. We had to negotiate our way through a tangle of overgrown pathways and crumbling gravestones. The vault was located in a near inaccessible portion of the hillside cemetery, and as we proceeded through the undergrowth with thick brambles catching on our trousers, the guide told me that he had only once before visited this vault. This had been in the company of another man whose description led me to conclude that it had been Muswell himself. The guide mentioned that this particular area was a source of some curiosity to the various guides, volunteers, and conservationists who worked here. Although wildlife flourished in other parts of the cemetery, here it was conspicuous by its absence. Even the birds seemed to avoid the place. I remember distinctly that the sun had just set, and that we reached the tomb in the twilight, The sycamores around us only added to the gloom. Then I caught sight of an arched roof covered with ivy just ahead, and the guide told me that we had reached our destination. As we approached it, and the structure came fully into view, I felt a mounting sense of anticipation. Some of the masonry had crumbled away, but it was still an impressive example of high Victorian Gothic architecture. The corners of its square exterior were adorned with towers, and each side boasted a miniature portico. On one of the sides, almost obliterated by neglect and decay, was a memorial stone bearing the epitaph, Lilith Blake, born 25 December 1874, died 1 November 1896. "It is getting late," the guide whispered to me. "We must get back." I saw his face in the gloom, and he had a restless expression. His words had broken in on the strange silence that enveloped the area. I nodded absently, but made my way around to the front of the vault, and the rusty trellis gates blocking the entrance to a stairway that led down to Lilith's coffin. Peering through the gates, I could see the flight of stairs covered by lichen, but darkness obscured its lower depths. The guide was at my elbow now and tugging my jacket sleeve. Come on," he moaned. "I could get in real trouble for doing this." There was something down there. I had the unnerving sensation that I was, in turn, being scrutinized by some presence in that perpetual darkness. It was almost as if it were trying to communicate with me, and images began to form in my mind, flashes of distorted scenes, of corpses that did not rot, of dreams that things no longer human might dream. Then the guide got a grip of my arm and began forcibly dragging me away. I stumbled along with him as if in a trance, but the hallucinations seemed to fade the further away we got from the vault, and by the time we reached the main gate I had regained my mental faculties. Thereafter, the guide refused any request that I made for him to again take me to the vault, and my attempts to persuade his colleagues were met with the same response. In the end, I was no longer even granted access to the cemetery on official tours. I later learned that my connection with Muswell had been discovered, and that he had caused much trouble to the cemetery authorities in the past with his demands for unsupervised access. On one occasion, there had even been threats of legal action for trespassing. As indicated, Muswell had informed me that I was to be his literary executor, and thus his collection of Blakeiana was left in my control. I also gained possession of his rooms, so I turned again to the study of Blake's work, hoping therein to further my understanding of the enigma that had taken control of my life. I had still to read The White Hands and other tales, and had been put off doing so by Muswell's insistence that this would enlighten me. I still held to the view that his mystical interpretation was fallacious, and the thought that this book might be what he actually claimed it to be was almost detestable to me. I wanted desperately to believe that Muswell had written the book himself, rather than as a conduit for Blake. And yet, even if I dismissed the fact of his peculiar hands, so like Blake's own, even if I put that down to some self-inflicted mutilation due to his long, disordered mental state, not to mention the book's comparatively recent age, still there remained the experience at the vault to undermine my certainty. And so it was to The White Hands and other tales that I turned, hoping there to determine matters once and for all. I had only managed to read the title story. Frankly, the book was too hideous for anyone but a lunatic to read in its entirety. The tale was like an incantation. The further one progressed, the more incomprehensible and sinister the words became. They were sometimes reversed and increasingly obscene. The words in that book conjured visions of eternal desolation. The little that I had read had already damaged my own mind. I became obsessed with the idea of Blake lying in her coffin, dreaming, and waiting for me to liberate her. During the nights of sleeplessness, her voice would call across the dark. When I was able to sleep, strange dreams came to me. I would be walking among pale shades in an overgrown and crumbling necropolis. The moonlight seemed abnormally bright, and even filtered down to the catacombs, where I would follow the shrouded form of Lilith Blake. The world of the dead seemed to be replacing my own. For weeks, I drew down the blinds in Maas Wells' library, shutting out the daylight, lost in my speculations. As time passed, I began to wonder just why Maas Wells had been so insistent that he must be interred with Blake at all costs. My experiences at her vault, and the strange hallucinations that I had suffered, might they not have been authentic after all? Could it be that Maas Wells had actually divined some other mode of existence beyond death, which I, too, had gleaned only dimly? I did not reach this conclusion lightly. I had explored many avenues of philosophical inquiry before coming back again and again to the conclusion that I might have to rely on Maas Wells' own interpretation. The critical book on Blake that I proposed to write floundered, lost in its own limitations. For, incredible as it seemed, the only explanation that lay before me was that the corpse itself did harbor some form of unnatural sentience, and that close contact with it brought final understanding of the mystery. I sought to solve a riddle beyond life and death, yet feared the answer. The image that held the solution to the enigma which tormented me was the corpse of Lilith Blake. I had to see it in the flesh. I decided that I would arrange for the body to be exhumed and brought to me here in Maas Wells' my rooms. It took me weeks to make the necessary contacts and raise the money required. How difficult it can be to get something done, even something so seemingly simple. How tedious the search for the sordid haunts of the necessary types, the hints dropped in endless conversations with untrustworthy strangers in dirty public houses. How venal, how mercenary is the world at large. During the nights of sleeplessness, Lilith Blake's voice would sometimes seem to call to me across the darkness. When I was able to sleep, I encountered beautiful dreams, where I would be walking among pale shades in an overgrown and crumbling necropolis. The moonlight seemed abnormally bright, and even filtered down to the catacombs where I would find Lilith's shrouded form. At last terms were agreed. 2 laborers were hired to undertake the job, and on the appointed night I waited in my rooms. Outside the rain was falling heavily, and in my mind's eye, as I sat anxiously in the armchair smoking cigarette after cigarette, I saw the deed done. The 2 simpletons, clad in their raincoats and with crowbars and pickaxes, climbing over the high wall which ran along Swain's Lane, stumbling through the storm and the overgrown grounds past stone angels and ruined monuments, down worn steps to the circular avenue, deep in the earth, but open to the mottled gray and black sky. Wet leaves must have choked the passageways. I could see the rain sweeping over the hillside cemetery as they levered open the door to her vault, their coats flapping in the wind. The memory of Lilith Blake's face rose before me through the hours that passed. I seemed to see it in every object that caught my gaze. I had left the blind up and watched the rain beating at the window above me, the water streaming down the small Georgian panes. I began to feel like an outcast of the universe. As I waited, The eyes in the clock on the mantelpiece stared back at me. I thought I saw 2 huge and thin white spiders crawling across the books on the shelves. At last there were 3 loud knocks on the door, and I came to in my chair, my heart pounding in my chest. I opened the door to the still pouring rain, and there at last, shadowy in the night, were my 2 grave robbers. They were smiling unpleasantly, their hair plastered down over their warm white faces. I pulled the wad of banknotes from my pocket and stuffed them into the nearest one's grasp. They lugged the coffin inside and set it down in the middle of the room. And then they left me alone with the thing. For a while the sodden coffin dripped silently onto the rug, the dark pools forming at its foot spreading slowly outwards, sinking gradually into the worn and faded pile. Although its wooden boards were decrepit and disfigured with dank patches of greenish mold, the lid remained securely battened down by a phalanx of rusty nails. I had prepared for this moment carefully. I had all the tools I needed ready in the adjoining room, but a sudden sense of foreboding, made me hesitate foolishly. At last, with a massive effort of will, I fetched the claw hammer and chisel and knelt beside the coffin. Once I had prized the lid upwards and then down again, leaving the rusted nail tops proud, I drew them out, one by one. It seemed to take forever, levering each one up and out and dropping it onto the slowly growing pile at my feet. My lips were dry, and I could barely grip the tools in my slippery hands. The shadows of the rain still trickling down the window were thrown over the room and across the coffin by the orange glow of the street lamp outside. Very slowly, I lifted the lid. Resting in the coffin was a figure clothed in a muslin shroud that was discolored with age. Those long hands and attenuated fingers were folded across its bosom. Lilith Blake's raven-black hair seemed to have grown whilst she had slept in the vault, and it reached down to her waist. Her head was lost in shadow, so I bent closer to examine it. There was no trace of decay in the features, which were those in the photograph, and yet they now had a horrible aspect, quite unlike that decomposition I might have anticipated. The skin was puffy and white, resembling paint applied on a tailor's dummy. Those fleshy lips that had so attracted me in the photograph were now repulsive. They were lusterless, and drew back from her yellowed, sharp little teeth. The eyes were closed, and even the lashes seemed longer, as if they too had grown, and they reminded me of the limbs of a spider. As I gazed at the face and fought back my repulsion, I had again the sensation that I had experienced at the vault. Consciousness seemed to mingle with dreams. The 2 states were becoming one, and I saw visions of some hellish ecstasy. At first, I again glimpsed corpses that did not rot, as if a million graves had been opened, illuminated by the phosphoric radiance of suspended decay. But these gave way to wilder nightmares that I could glimpse only dimly, as if through a billowing vapor. Nightmares that, to see clearly, would result in my mind being destroyed. And I could not help being reminded of the notion that what we term sanity is only a measure of success in concealing underlying madness. Then I came back to myself and saw Lilith Blake appearing to awaken. As she slowly opened her eyes, the spell was broken, and I looked into them with mounting horror. They were blank and repugnant, no longer belonging in a human face. The eyes of a thing that had seen sights no living creature could see. Then one of her hands reached up, and her long fingers clutched feebly against my throat as if trying to scratch or perhaps caress me. With the touch of those clammy hands, I managed to summon up enough self-control to close the lid and begin replacing the coffin nails, fighting against the impulses that were driving me to gaze again upon the awakened apparition. Then, during a lull in the rain, I burned the coffin and its deathly contents in the backyard. As I watched the fire build, I thought that I heard a shrieking, like a curse being invoked in the sinister and incomprehensible language of Blake's tale. But the noise was soon lost in the roar of the flames. It was only after many days that I discovered that the touch of Lilith Blake's long white fingers had produced marks that, once visible, remained permanently impressed upon my throat. I traveled abroad for some months afterwards, seeking southern climes bathed in warm sunshine and blessed with short nights. But my thoughts gradually returned to the white hands and other tales. I wondered if it might be possible to achieve control over it, to read it in its entirety, and use it to attain my goal. Finally, its lure proved decisive. I convinced myself that I had already borne the darkest horrors, that this would have proved a meet preparation for its mysteries, however obscenely they were clothed. And so, returning once more to Highgate, I began the task of transcribing and interpreting the occult language of the book, delving far into its deep mysteries. Surely I could mold the dreams to my own will and overcome the nightmare. Once I had achieved this, I would dwell forever in paradise. Text of a letter written by John Harrington whilst under confinement in Maudsley Psychiatric Hospital. My dearest wife, Lilith, I do not know why you have not written or come to see me. The gentlemen looking after me here are very kind, but will not allow any mirrors. I know there is something awful about my face. Everyone is scared to look at it. They have taken your book away. They say it is gibberish. But I know all the secrets now. Sometimes I laugh and laugh. But I like the white hands that crawl around my bed at night like two spiders. They laugh with me. Please write or come. With all my heart, John.